Hey y'all, so I know this board looks pretty overwhelming, but we did just knock out 4 chapters of um, the Scarlet Letter. So I do want to talk a little bit about each section and just kind of the key points. I'm not going to spend a whole lot of time on chapters 2 and 3 just because I know that you guys have already read them and you're working on your newsreels as I speak. And then we'll talk a little bit about chapters 4 and 5. It is important for you guys to take notes and also think about some of the ideas that I'm posing for you all, just because tomorrow when we meet in Zoom on Friday the 27th, I will be asking you some of these questions again, and that is going to be part of your Zoom participation, is answering these questions that I have for you. So let's start with chapter 2, okay, which is called The Marketplace. So we start off with Hester leaving for her daily stroll to the scaffold, as I called it earlier. And one of the things to realize about the society that Hester is in, similar to the Crucible, this is the theocracy, okay, meaning that the Massachusetts Bay Colony was governed by both religion and the government together, okay, or the politics together, okay, they join forces. So we have Governor Billingham, who's also overlooking this scene with Hester, and then we also have John Wilson and Arthur Dimmesdale, who are part of the church, and we'll talk about that a little bit in a minute. And so as Hester is doing her walk of shame, she's surrounded by all these townspeople, right? And they're pretty judgmental, okay? In fact, the things that they say about Hester are pretty awful. But one thing that you might not have noticed that I want to bring to your attention is that a lot of these older women are coming from Old England, okay? Then you also have this new generation of women that had just been born in the Bay Colony. They're kind of like in their late teens, okay? But keep in mind, that was a prime time to be having children. So obviously these women in their late teens that are telling these older women to kind of be nicer to Hester are showing different views. So these other older women from England are saying like she should have this branded on her head, that she should be killed. They're being pretty harsh towards her. They're calling her a hussy and all these terrible things as she's walking by. And this one young girl, this teenager that is already a mother, does say, you know, she probably already feels this grief enough. Maybe you should be quiet. And they all lash out at this young girl who's kind of sticking up for Hester to some point. So interesting to see that change, that generational shift. Protagonist is obviously Hester Prynne, okay? And I want to talk a little bit too about the scarlet letter that she wears. So she comes out, and the reason that she wears the scarlet letter is for adultery, right? And she presents this letter in a very ornate and elaborate way, right? You cannot miss the A that is glaring off of Hester's chest. And then these women find fault for that too, right? They go off on her saying that she has no sort of remorse for what she's done and that she's proud of what she's done. So they see this as a way of her showing off her bad behavior, like being the bad girl, right? Meanwhile, she's using this as a way to embrace her sin and acknowledge that she's done a pretty bad thing, okay? So we see her go through this. Instead of being put to death, Hester is sentenced to be publicly humiliated, basically for 3 hours a day, every day, for about 2 to 3 years, okay? So that's her punishment. There's a very powerful illusion that Hawthorne uses in this chapter, and it's this comparison to Hester, because as Hester is walking to the scaffold, so basically a scaffold, it's kind of like a stage, okay, that was where the guillotine used to be, like off with their heads, right? But now it's just a place for public shaming. And she comes up and she's holding her baby to her bosom, right? And the Hawthorne compares her to the Madonna, okay? The Madonna being the Virgin Mary holding baby Jesus. So you've got this very innocent figure with the Mother Mary, and then obviously this more sinful creature with Hester and her child. But the thing that's interesting is even though both of these women represent something, some sort of character trait, they're both holding a child that signifies innocence, okay? Hester's child has done nothing wrong, okay? She's born out of sin, but she's still innocent herself, okay? Obviously, baby Jesus sin-free, okay, full of innocence as well. And then we start to learn a little bit about Hester's life, right? Hester steps on the scaffold and she's brought back to all of her memories from Old England and Amsterdam, and she starts to reflect and feel nostalgic about her past life. She remembers her family, right? Again, in Old England, it's pretty obvious that she didn't come from a very affluent family. And then we start to see her shift over to Amsterdam, where she's with this older man that she recognizes having kind of a hunchback, that he's misshapen. Okay, she mentions this, and then she looks down at her child and the emblem, the letter, and she realizes what her new reality is. Okay, so this is really where we see Hester transform. Again, keep in mind, Hester isn't old. Okay, she is probably in her late teens, early 20s. Okay, she's not an old woman, so this is quite a transition and transformation to have at this age. So then we move on to the recognition. Okay, this is what I like to call the stranger danger chapter, because this is when we meet the ex-hubby, if you will. But obviously we don't know that till chapter 4. So chapter 3, we learn about this stranger that comes to watch the public shaming of Hester Prynne. He doesn't know what's going on, right? And he is described as being a very dark looking character. He's got this hunchback. Okay, he's said to be short in stature and having a very smart look about him. And we start to realize that this is a smart man, okay? But the other thing that's interesting, he comes into town with somebody. He has an Indian guide with him. And we learn later on that this man had been kept by the Indians for a length of time, okay? And he actually learned medicine from these Indians. So odds are Chillingworth's ship probably, didn't go to the right place, or it shipwrecked, whatever, and then he ended up being captured by Indians, okay? So anyway, we learned a little bit about his physical appearance, and then he learns about Hester's predicament by asking one of the people in the town, and they tell him that she's been accused of adultery and is now going to be publicly shamed. And the stranger recognizes Hester, right? And the stranger tells the stranger that the only reason that she isn't being hung is because her husband never came to the US. So which obviously wasn't the US back then. So what had happened was that Hester left Amsterdam before Chillingworth. So he sent her before him because he had other odds and ends to tie up. And she arrives to the colony, but he never does. This is for 2 years, okay? So the only reason that these people are giving her this sort of what they term a lackadaisical punishment is because they think that her husband might be dead, okay? However, she's still being punished regardless of her husband being dead for maybe 2 years. And so, again, they do make eye contact, Chillingworth and Hester. And Hester knows exactly who that is. But the stranger puts his hand to his lips, okay, like, keep quiet, don't tell anyone I'm here, all right? And this starts to put her in a tizzy, Hester. So then we're introduced to John Wilson and Arthur Dimmesdale. So Arthur Dimmesdale is going to be a major character later on in the novel. John Wilson, we're going to see a fair amount, but he's more of a minor character. But he is the head of the church, okay? And he's trying to extrapolate who the father of Hester's child is. But Hester will not budge, okay? And Dimmesdale is actually her pastor, meaning he's the one that she goes to church to see. He's the one that listens to her sins, so on and so forth. And he does tell Wilson that this is inappropriate, that it's inappropriate for her to confess her sin to the public. And he actually equates it to essentially raping her in front of everybody else. So Wilson doesn't really listen to this. Instead, he's like, okay, Dimmesdale, you figure it out. So Dimmesdale does plead with Hester to say who the father is. But again, she stays stubborn. But I do want you to think about what appeals Dimmesdale uses on Hester to try and get her to confess the lover that she had. The other thing to keep in mind about Arthur Dimmesdale. So Hawthorne goes through a lengthy paragraph describing his physical appearance and kind of some of his personality traits, some of the things that he does, okay? So he, he becomes pale, okay? We know that he seems to be touching his heart, okay? He seems a lot more shy and introverted than John Wilson, who's a lot more authoritative. He says that he's sympathetic in his nature. He doesn't seem to be very sympathetic, right? Dimmesdale does, okay? He does seem to be sympathetic. In fact, at the very end, when Hester still refuses to say who the husband is, he actually identifies Hester's generosity, which is a big thing to do considering everybody thinks Hester's a terrible person for the one thing she did wrong. Okay, so at the very end of this chapter, we learn Hester is becoming this living sermon on sin, okay? And in fact, even though Dimmesdale can't draw this confession out of her, John Wilson ends up using her as kind of a prop for his sermon while she's standing on the scaffold, okay? And as she's standing there, essentially being ridiculed in the middle of Wilson's sermon, she becomes indifferent to the entire situation, meaning she just doesn't care and she takes it for what it is. And she kind of surrenders into it, okay? Because it's out of her control. She made a mistake and now she has to suffer the repercussions, and she recognizes that, okay? So then we move on to chapter 4, the interview. And this is when we start to learn more about Hester's husband, named Roger Chillingworth. So later on in this chapter, he does say, do not respond to me as your husband. Do not let anybody know that we were married, because I don't want to be held as a cuckold, okay? Meaning someone who has had their wife cheat on them, okay? It's an old Shakespearean term. So Roger Chillingworth is not his real name, okay? It was something Prynne, maybe it was Roger Prynne, who knows? But he takes on this new persona because he doesn't want to have any sort of connection with Hester, all right? So when we start this chapter, Hester is still pretty frenzied and she's still pretty uptight over the whole scenario, which we can totally understand, right? Standing in front of a bunch of people on a scaffold for 3 hours so they can ridicule you as she's holding a crying baby that will not stop because she's feeling the same emotions as her mother. Of course the chick's stressed out. So we can totally understand that. So because she's still frenzied, the baby ends up becoming restless. So she probably ended up colicking the child. So for those of you who don't know what colic is, basically babies can't puke. So when their tummies get upset, they get really fussy, okay? And you want to try to move them around to get things moving again. So the person that is watching Hester in the jail is concerned, first off, about Hester feeling so frenzied, but also the child. So he sends for this physician, Roger Chillingworth, okay, aka Dr. Chillingworth, okay, and he comes in to help Hester and the child. And Hester is a little standoffish about this. She doesn't quite trust Chillingworth because she knows what she's done, okay? And Chillingworth gets kind of annoyed with her because he feels like Hester should know him better, and he says, do you really think I would take my revenge out on you, on your child? Okay, so he does recognize the innocence of the child and is not going to parlay any sort of vengeance on her. And in fact, he does the same, he doesn't put any revenge on Hester either, to some degree, right? So Hester is obviously frenzied. He gives her some medicine, and again, she's trepidatious about it. And then she also says, well, I've kind of thought about killing myself because this is just a really terrible predicament to be in. And he was like, do you really think that this is how I would seek revenge on you, is by poisoning you? And he is genuinely trying to help her and make her calm down. And then we start to learn too that Chillingworth blames himself a lot too for the scenario, okay? We start to learn that Chillingworth is significantly older than Hester. Hester is obviously a babe, right? And Chillingworth doesn't sound like a hoodle hunk or anything, okay? He's got this hunchback, he's kind of short, okay? And we start to learn too that he's a scholar, right? That he locked himself in his study all the time and was very bookish and didn't really give his young wife the proper attention that she needed. So he blames himself, and he's definitely heartbroken about this, right? He was truly in love with Hester, and Hester straight up tells him, like, I told you I never loved you, which also is a little bit heart-wrenching. So to him, he does say that in his opinion, vengeance is already equally balanced, okay? He basically took away her innocence in her youth, and she found some sort of affair, okay? So he feels like they're even. But he wants to know who the lover is and seek vengeance on that man. And once again, Hester refuses to tell him. And he straight up says, I will figure this out for myself. And unfortunately, Hester recognizes that Chillingworth is pretty darn smart, and if anyone's going to figure out, it's probably going to be Chillingworth. The other thing, too, that Chillingworth mentions to Hester is that he doesn't need to seek vengeance because Hester is now branded with this letter for her entire life, and she has a child. He's like, you've got enough guilt on your heart. I don't need to add on to it. So there's kind of the sympathetic aspect of Chillingworth, but not too much either. Again, we know that he's going to start to seek revenge on whoever the lover is, which we don't really know who the lover is at this point. But the other thing I want to bring to your attention is two things. Okay, so we have this name, Roger Chillingworth, right? There's some symbolism to this name, okay? This idea of chilling, right? He's kind of cold. He's not very heartfelt, okay, which also could have been why they didn't have such a strong relationship to begin with. But we also have this physical deformity with Chillingworth, okay, this humpback, okay, the misshapen shoulders, okay, maybe it's illustrating the misshapen soul. Good one, right? Okay, so thinking about how the physical connects with the mind, all right? So again, we're starting to see some connections with Poe and Hawthorne that we might not have seen before, right? We're seeing these elements of revenge, we're seeing kind of this dark, sinister type characters. And at one point, Hester even says that she feels like she's made a deal with the black man himself, right? Because now that he's going after Hester's lover, who she obviously wants to keep safe, she feels like it's kind of a satanic deal that she's made with Chillingworth. Because he says, if you tell anyone who I am, I'll kill your lover, okay, once he finds him. So pretty intense chapter. And then chapter 5, we see another revelation with Hester. So there's a lot of character growth within Hester through the first 5 chapters. And we continue to see her grow throughout the novel, excuse me. But she is faced with a huge decision when she's released from jail. First, she doesn't know where she's going to go. She has the choice to leave the Bay Colony, right? But she decides to stay for a couple of reasons. One, because she feels like she needs to stay at the place where her sin was committed. But 2, she also wants to be able to see her lover, okay? And just, even though they might not be able to have any sort of interactions, just seeing him gives her some comfort, which is kind of cute. So she ends up going out to the outskirts in the woods. Well, probably like right outside the woods. And that's where she decides to stay, okay? But she has this other decision too. And there's this quote in the novel, and it says, she must sustain and carry forward or sink beneath it. Okay, so she could easily just like fall into a depression and become very cynical and bitter, or she can find a way to rise above it. And she does, okay, which shows us too how Hester faces adversity, okay? Is she perseverant or does she fold? She seems to persevere. And the way that she does that is through her needlework. So she uses her needlework to kind of find some sort of catharsis and solace in her life, okay? But she also uses it as a way to make money, and she also uses it as a way to help the poor, okay? Even though the poor don't take very kindly to Hester, right? Even though she makes them clothes, they're still really mean to her because of the sin that she committed. Again, even though Hester is great at needlework and she adorns her daughter in these beautiful, lavish clothes, she dresses very modestly because she takes that as part of her sin, okay? She's no longer allowed to dress above her station, okay? There's also this massive hypocrisy that we're seeing within the Puritan society, okay? Which again is pretty similar to what we've seen with Hawthorne, but even with Arthur Miller too. And the hypocrisy that we see here is that the townspeople end up using Hester for her needlework, and they even say how beautiful it is. However, they still are so mean to her. Even when she comes into the house, they just look at her coldly and say nasty things to her. So, you know, she's good enough to sew for them, but she's not good enough to have a kind word spoken to. Makes you think. The other thing to remember, even though she can sew tons of different things, she cannot make wedding veils, because that is for the pure, and she's no longer pure. Okay. She does find, let me go back again to her dressing the poor. So she finds this, the way that people treat her, she first considers this her penance, right? Her penance is to make clothes for the poor for free, and also to be treated pretty harshly, she feels, as part of her penance for what she's done. And then the thing that's kind of interesting about Hester, and it says this in the novel too, she finds her place in society. Even though she's completely ostracized and isolated from society, she finds her place in the world, which makes me ask, how important is this for us as humans? How important is it for us to find our place in humanity and the world around us, especially when we're ostracized? Kind of worth asking this question right now too. Okay, we still have a place even though we might be isolated from one another. The other thing that we see with Hester is she starts to develop this understanding of those who have sinned before. So she starts to develop compassion for those who have sinned and understanding how they were ostracized from society. So she sees sin in a completely different way. Okay, she has this sympathetic knowledge because she's got firsthand experience of it now. But she also sees humanity in a very different way. And she starts to lose faith in humanity because, again, even though Hester's doing all of these good deeds, the only deed that they can remember is her having an affair and her committing adultery. Okay, she seems like probably a better Puritan than most of the Puritans within her society, but nobody will welcome her back into society because of what she's done. So, again, we see a lot of themes from some of the other short stories that Hawthorne's written, and he continues to make those connections even in this novel. All right, so for homework, you are going to be reading chapters 5 and 6. Tomorrow, Friday, March 27th, we will be Zooming. We'll be talking about those chapters, and I'll probably be throwing you some other questions from these chapters as well, just to make sure everybody's catching up with the reading. Again, big things to take away from this one that I really want you thinking about are the appeals that Dimmesdale uses on Hester, and also this idea about how important it is to find a place within society, even if we might not be within society itself. Okay. Also how Hester responds to adversity and how she develops in these 5 chapters. Okay, 4 chapters, I'm sorry. We all know Mrs. Ross is bad at math. And I think those are really the big things I want you to consider. So what this all shows about her character, differences in generations, so on and so forth. All right. So I think that's all I've got for you guys today. Enjoy the rest of your day, and I look forward to Zooming with you all tomorrow. Stay healthy, stay safe.